So after you've tested your prototype with customers, you have the opportunity now to improve your product market fit. So you've worked your way through the whole pyramid of this stage. You've identified your target customer in part 1. You've examined their underserved needs in part 2. You've understood the value proposition in part 3. You've developed your feature set in part 4. You've created that prototype and the user experience in part 5. And then you've tested that all the way back around in part 6 with your target customer. Now, sometimes you do this once, you're in pretty good shape, you've got a few refinements to make on your product, and you're off and running. More often, you've got to do this more than once. There might be information during that testing process that you've got to rethink a few things. You've got to rethink a few things about perhaps the target customer, who you thought was the customer, in reality is a little bit different. Maybe their needs are a little bit different. You've got to refine those a bit. Maybe you got those right, but the value propositions were not necessarily formulated perfectly the first time. Or maybe you got that right, but you're missing a couple of features. Or maybe you got the features right, but your design has some faults, some room for improvement. Or maybe a couple of those things are in play. So don't necessarily look at the pyramid and think it's a one-way road that you only get one shot at. You might need to do it twice. You might need to do it 3 times. Now, in the subsequent times, it should be a bit faster to move through, a bit easier to do since you're revising it and not starting from scratch. But don't be afraid about doing it more than once. It's worth the time and effort. What it lets you do as you work through this too is to begin thinking about the build, measure, learn loop that we've talked about briefly before. Now, when we build something, you might think about building a sellable product. That's true, but it's also the wireframe itself. So when you look at this, recognize that you're going to have ideas. You can build those ideas with the code and the complementary data to support it. But you might be building, again, the sellable product or a very high fidelity wireframe or prototype as well. From there, you go out, you see what people think about it. You measure qualitatively and quantitatively their reaction. And then you're learning. You're learning answers to the questions you've asked, or you might be developing some new hypotheses that you want to test as well. And this, again, is a circular activity that you do somewhat constantly, even after the product is launched in its final form. Where you hope to get to, after you've worked your way through the product pyramid, either the first time or the second or third time, is you have a very solid definition of exactly what it is you want to build. You've got solid, high-fidelity, interactive wireframes if you're doing an app or software product, or you've got a very well-defined physical product, very detailed schematics. You know exactly what it's going to do, how it's going to work. The bottom part of this chart represents the data structure. So if you're working with software or apps, you know all the data, what inputs you need, what analytics or decisions or formulas you're going to apply to it, what algorithms you're going to need, as well as what's the output going to be. So again, you want to have it all figured out with a level of certainty before you take the next step of deciding where to go from here.